Hello and welcome back to Weathering the Storm, a podcast where we strive to weather the storms of life by placing and sustaining an unwavering faith in God. I'm your host, Drew Suttles, and I am excited to have you back with me today, excited to continue our study of the Minor Prophets. Today we are recording episode 9, and we'll also be looking at the book of Hosea. We're going to talk about that pronunciation here in just a moment, but thinking about this book, thinking about this prophet, one of the larger of the minor prophets, and so because of that, we're going to break this study into two parts. And so we'll be recording episode 9 as well as episode 10 today. And so hopefully, Lord willing, next week you'll be able to hear episode 10. But with me today and recording both episodes is Jameson Stewart. Jameson is no stranger to Weathering the Storm podcast. He's, of course, a member of the Scattered Abroad Network. But I do want to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself a little bit further.
Yeah, hey, good to be back with you, Drew, on the podcast. I'm Jameson Stewart. I guess I've been involved with a few different podcasts on here. I guess the one I did for a little while was Asking God Why. Certainly enjoyed doing that. Now still involved, kind of being more guest on various folks' program now and kind of involved in a more behind-the-scenes way with Scattered Abroad. But still glad to be involved and glad to be back with you on Weathering the Storm.
Yes, sir. Thank you for being on here. And to those listening, we just had Jameson here at the Quitman congregation to hold a weekend workshop on the book of Daniel. It was a great job. It was well received. Really enjoyed that. And so it's talked to him then. We were going to record then, but it made it easier to kind of hold off till now and give us some more time to look at this and study it. But Jameson, I've asked every guest so far this season, I want to try to do this all season long. If somebody were to come to you and say, I've never studied the minor prophets before, and I'm thinking about starting it, and they ask you, should I do it, what would be your response?
Yeah, it's the minor prophets are a great study. They're not, get ready for a lot of challenging things. There's a lot of storms, if you will, in the minor prophets. They all, well, not all of them, but most of them, they're sort of like sermons, really. Jonah's obviously a bit different, but most of these are basically like one sermon or it's multiple sermons all grouped together. So yeah, I think, especially when it comes to helping us through challenges, perhaps the worldliness around us, calling people back to God, the minor prophets are a fantastic resource from that point of view, because that's what the vast majority of them are, is you're sinning, you need to turn back to God. God's merciful, He's kind, He's wanting to forgive you, but you have to turn back to Him. If not, there are going to be consequences. And that's kind of the message of most of the minor prophets. They all approach it different ways, but that's kind of the big picture message of a lot of minor prophets. And so it is important for us to remind ourselves of that message.
Absolutely. And really that's the message that we're studying in this book. Someone has said that this book could be titled Return to God, because that's really the theme. So with that being said, we want to introduce the book of Hosea. You may pronounce it Hosea, you might hear Hosea, or even Hosea, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I know growing up, when we learned the books of the Bible, we didn't say Hosea Daniel. So for most folks, it's Hosea. We know who we're talking about. But he was the last writing prophet to minister to Israel before they fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC. And I think that's pretty important. Giving us a time frame of what was going on there in the northern kingdom. And then he was the only writing prophet of Israel to Israel. So you take in that, as we think about a storm, these were his own people that he talked to. That must have made it even more difficult. In fact, he's been called the prophet of Israel's 0 hour. I thought that was a pretty good idea there. We think about idolatry, immorality, just an outright rejection of God is what we find from his own people. And so Hosea was having to deal with that. His name does mean salvation. It's the same root word as we think about Joshua, Numbers 13:16, or even Jesus, Matthew 1:21, and that's why you might hear a different pronunciation of it. But I think that's interesting. There's a connection then between the name and salvation. Think about Acts 4:12. And another interesting thought here or theme is that during Hosea's ministry, there were 7 kings that reigned over Israel and 4 kings that reigned over Judah's throne. So you imagine, kind of like we studied Daniel a few weeks ago, thinking about what Daniel went through with different kings that were reigning and how that would have been, a unique time. And then another thought introducing this is the book of Hosea is quoted more than 30 times in the New Testament. And that's pretty powerful to think. Like there's some books, like Obadiah, for example, that's not quoted at all. And then you've got Hosea quoted 30 times, just to shows the correlation, the impact of this Old Testament book, even when you study the New Testament. So that's kind of an overview or introduction. Is there anything you want to add or anything you might have a little bit different?
No, well, the only thing I thought of is when you were talking about Hosea as being like the Israel's 0-hour prophet.
Mm-hmm.
He was kind of the last one before they fell to Assyria. I guess in some ways, and I was thinking about this, is in some ways a lot of his message, and I guess a lot of the emotions behind it's very similar to what Jeremiah did to the southern kingdom, because he was the prophet that was there and prophesying to Judah some 140, 120 years or so later when Judah falls, the southern kingdom falls. So, and Judah and Jeremiah is kind of the hometown prophet for Judah in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of similarities. You're going to find some of the same themes, a lot of the same emotions that happen between Jeremiah and Hosea, because they're both going through the same thing.
Yeah.
Just with different kingdoms.
Yeah, and like you said, the emotion, the human element of being at home, talking to their own people, that must have hurt them. So I'm glad you brought that out. It's a great connection. Thinking about the theme for this book is you have a loving God who's offering basically an opportunity at redemption and restoration to Israel, who has committed spiritual adultery against him. Israel is depicted as the unfaithful wife going after other lovers, the idea of, idolatry, immorality, and so, again, spiritual adultery. And you think about Hosea here, we're going to read it in just a moment, but God gave him an actual object lesson of who he was going to marry and what she was going to do. And so this is one of the storms we'll talk about at the end of this episode, but I can't help but wonder how that must have impacted him. He was going through it and living it, and then to think, man, this is how God feels with my people who are not following him and who have become unfaithful. I got this in my notes from Bob Winton's commentary about the various kinds of sin that was rampant in Israel. They offered illegal sacrifices from the high places. They practiced open idolatry. Women prostituted themselves at the local shrines. They entered entangling alliances with other nations, and the nation put its trust in material things instead of in God. I mean, really, you think about the book of Judges. You think about the Old Testament, period. That's really a summation. Going back to what you were saying with the minor prophets, the main message was they're the consequences of not obeying God, and they lived through those. But here you have a prophet, a man of God, who's living through this and having to prophesy to people who are separating themselves from God because of their sin. So again, Hosea knew what it was like because he was told to marry a harlot who committed adultery against him. But the nation was invited back, and we'll get to that in chapter 14, hopefully in episode 2. So the message of the book is return to the Lord your God. In other words, before it's too late, don't keep going in this wrong direction. Come back to God. That's kind of the theme. So what would you think or add maybe to the theme of the book of Hosea?
Yeah, just kind of, it gives us, obviously the scriptures are looking to the mind of God. It's him communicating his will to us, but also books like this, like you said, it also kind of gives you a picture of this is what in a way, I guess, God is feeling, the emotions of it. In fact, some of the verses that we'll talk about, Lord willing, this episode and in the next one, it talks about specifically God describes this is what I'm feeling as I'm watching you go on this path away from me. This is what I'm experiencing watching you do this to yourself. And so books like Hosea, that's an interesting look. It's not just God has certainly given us, here is my will, this is my word to you, but it also is God at times explains, this is what I'm experiencing watching you do what you're doing.
Yeah. And it is unique, the way that he uses these descriptive terms that really you don't see in other books. So it's really a powerful theme. As we think about an outline of the book, again, this is a lengthy book as far as the minor prophets are concerned. We talked about that in the first 2 episodes of this season, that they're not minor because they're less important, but minor because there's a lot less as far as reading material. You've got Obadiah, 1 chapter, shortest book in the Old Testament, Joel, and some of these other books that are real short and small. So for 14 chapters, relatively speaking, this is a large book. But there's a 3-point outline that I've got in my notes that I kind of look at. You have a meaningful relationship, thinking about what marriage is supposed to be. You have a broken relationship, and then there's a restored relationship. And when you think about God and Israel, and you think about the meaning behind that, Deuteronomy chapter 7 comes to mind. He didn't choose them because they were larger and greater and more powerful, but he made a promise to Abraham and he was going to keep it. And then you think about the idea of the brokenness and the pain that comes with a broken relationship. And like you said, this is God using these terms. This is how I feel. And so you have the meaningful relationship, broken relationship, and restored relationship. And as far as a chapter breakdown, in chapters 1 through 3, there's a narrative. It's really kind of laying the foundation for what he's going through personally. And then in chapters 4 through 14, there's basically a call to be restored, a spiritual restoration. And so in this episode, we're going to look at chapters 1 through 3. And the next episode, Lord willing, we'll look at 4 through 14. And obviously, this won't be a verse-by-verse study, but we do want to highlight a few passages to think about as we think about Hosea and what he went through and the storms that he faced personally. So, Jameson, I want to start off by reading what we find in chapter 1 and verse 2 and get your thoughts here, because no doubt he faced a storm of having an unfaithful spouse and the emotional, the mental pain, the anguish that he had because of that. It says, when the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. So what are your thoughts there in verse 2?
Well, it's you think about the challenge of that is go get married, and by the way, the kind of person you're marrying is not the kind of individual that you would choose of your own accord to marry. In fact, he's going to tell him, I think, later in this book that not only is this her past, but this is going to continue to be her future too. This is going to be the kind of life she's going to live. So it's I guess it would be one thing, to take a wife, someone who has lived a life of harlotry, but then going forward into the future, you felt confident this wasn't going to happen anymore. But that's not really the reassurance that God gives Hosea. Is he tells him, look, this is who they've been, and this is who they're going to continue to be. You think about the challenge of that, but it also reminds us of the great love that God has for us, because, he decided to create us, that he had that plan from the foundation of the world, even though he knew what mankind was going to do against him. It's kind of the same thing. He's putting Hosea, as much as he can, he's putting Hosea in God's shoes here to see things from God's perspective.
Yeah, that's a great observation and a great point that, it's one thing that she was a harlot, but she's going to continue to be that way. And then the children that get involved. And you and I both know of folks who are, find themselves in a very difficult, painful situation because of sin. There's divorce. The children are affected. And that's no doubt what we find here, even in verses 3 through 8. And so moving on to that, you talk about another storm, there's a storm of family drama. And those listening, you may have your own form of that. But if you're listening and you don't know about family drama, then I'd like to talk to you and try to figure something out. Because I think everybody experiences this to some degree at some point in their lives, whether it's as a child or when you get married, or maybe when your children grow up and get married. There's always this dynamic because we're human beings, we're people. But I want you to notice the storm, not only as a husband, but as a father, that he's going through here. So in verses 3 through 8, it says that Hosea went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel. And of course, there's meanings behind these names. Here you have Jezreel. It says, for in a little while I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu and bring to an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So there you have a son who's named, and every time you call that name, it's going to be associated with what God says, the idea of avenging with bloodshed. You come to verse 6. It says, she conceived again and bore a daughter. And God said to him, call her name Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Again, powerful reminder with the name that every time that name is called, this is what's going to happen. And then in verse 8, it says that she weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Call his name Lo-Amah, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God. That theme's going to come back throughout the text, and even looking to the New Testament, to the church. You know, you were not a people, but now you're the people of God. We find in 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. But to me, it's just really powerful that it's a reminder that names matter, number one. They have meaning. But I couldn't help but think of the contrast with the book of Job. Remember when Job ends and he has the children, the names are given, it's associated with blessing, right? It's associated with good things. Yeah. Well, here, these children are born, and if I can say this, I don't want to be crude, but in an illegitimate way almost. You know, it's like, here's a harlot. She's going to continue in harlotry. She's going to be committing adultery. And by the way, there are going to be children involved. And here's what the names mean. So what are your thoughts there when it comes to this storm that he must have been facing?
Yeah, it's, thinking about the names of the kids, basically it's, the first one is the vengeance of God, judgment from God. And then the second name is no mercy from God. So this is going to be vengeance and judgment, and there's not going to be mercy. And then it's number 9, or verse 9, the third child. It's you're not my people.
Yeah.
That's a dark picture. Yeah. Judgment, no mercy, and you are not mine. Man. And for the nation of Israel, like I guess that's about as strong of a message as they could have received from Hosea. There will be judgment, there will be no mercy, and you're not mine anymore. And the children's names reminded Hosea and everyone who reads this of that fact. This is the path they had chosen to take as a people. This is, after all of the warnings from God that they had ignored and the pleadings they had refused to listen to, this is where it led them. This is where it ends up.
That's right. And it's a culmination of everything, like you said. And just amazing to me that what Hosea must have been going through, as a just man, as a godly man, knowing that God is absolutely right in what he's doing, he's just. But then to live through this, every single day, it just, to me, I'm thinking about this as a gospel preacher, and we've got brothers in Christ that preach that are battling through their own storms. That maybe they've been involved in a situation, a painful divorce, or whatever the case may be. They're going through financial problems, whatever. But to continue to do the work while battling through this storm can be exhausting. It can be very difficult. Yeah. And I can't help but think about the human element and the human side of Hosea going forth and preaching to these people. All the while he's going through it himself, but it also could have brought about an important element that it's like, kind of like you said earlier, it's kind of walking in someone else's shoes. You talk to someone and you've been through it. By him knowing how this feels, could have added an extra spark to his preaching to the people. Like, listen, you are committing spiritual adultery against God. And I happen to know how adultery feels. I happen to know the effect and the aftermath of it. And we don't want to depart from God. We need him. So there in chapter 1, it's just very, very dark, like you said, very dark when you think of the names. A vengeance of God, no mercy, you're not my people. That would be a hopeless situation. But when you get into chapter 2, now we talk about the unfaithfulness of the people. Again, here's a storm that he's facing. He's preaching, it reminds me of Ezekiel. God told Ezekiel, go preach to them, but by the way, they're not going to listen to you. They're hard-headed, hard-hearted. They don't listen to me. They're not going to listen to you. Very similar situation. And yet he still has a responsibility to go and preach, and he does. But just highlighting a few things, and this is verses 1 through 13. We won't read all of it. But in verse 4, he says, I will not have mercy on her children, for they are the children of harlotry. Their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has behaved shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool, my linen, my oil, and my drink. In other words, they're giving credit to these idol gods. They're looking at these pagan nations around them. We're going to give our allegiance. We're going to look unto them instead of looking to the God of heaven. And Hosea is living this and seeing this. I just think that right there is kind of a summation of verses 1 through 13 is going back to what you were saying earlier in verse 6. It's a reminder that you don't have God's mercy at this time. If you continue down this path, don't expect to receive that. But really, Hosea's message was, there's still hope for you. But make no mistake, if you continue going down this path, then don't expect, for God to be with you. So what are your thoughts there as we think about the unfaithfulness of the people? Kind of an overview there in chapter 2.
Yeah, well, and even kind of building on what you said there in verse 8, God says, for she did not know that I gave her grain, new wine, and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal. It's God saying, like you said, they're giving credit for all the good things they have to somebody or something else, when God says, I'm the one that gave all that to you. I was the one taking care of you all this time, but you have left me, and you said, oh no, this, Baal gave all this to me.
Yeah.
And God goes on to say, so I'm going to take it away from you to prove that it wasn't this idol God that you're serving that was giving it to you after all.
Yeah. Because
you're going to keep serving this idol God, but you're going to lose all this. So therefore, clearly this idol God's not giving it to you. And I guess it is a reminder, too, to remind us who really, I guess, is the provider for us. Sometimes if we're not careful, we think that we're the ones that do it. Seems to have been their mindset to some extent. We arrange these alliances, and it has really helped us out a lot. But they were missing that God was the one who blessed them with these things, and God was going to show them that they could try to do it on their own, but they weren't going to receive his blessing if they tried to do it all on their own.
It's kind of a similarity to Romans 1 and the idea of they were unthankful and worshiping the creature rather than the creator type deal. So that's a good point that you bring out is they were unfaithful to God and trying to have this kind of false faithfulness to a false God. And essentially chapter 2 is that's not going to work. It's not going to work out in the long run for them at all. Well, then we come to chapter 3, and this is really unique. I was reading through Hosea last night and just kind of jumped off the page that, man, this is a short chapter. There's some lengthy chapters, but this one is very short, 5 verses. And I want to just read this and then kind of get your thoughts here. And the idea is the children of Israel are going to return. But imagine in this moment how dark it was. It'd be hard to kind of see that. And we think about being in a storm. Sometimes it's hard to see, man, when's this rain going to stop? When's the storm going to stop? It's kind of the mental picture I get when I read this chapter. But I want to read this and turn it over to you. It says, the Lord said to me, go again, Love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who looked to other gods and loved the raisin cakes of the pagans. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver, 1 1/2 homers of barley. I said to her, You shall stay with me many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So too will I be toward you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. So what are your thoughts there in chapter 3? Again, it's a unique chapter, but what jumps out to you there?
Well, you just think about God tells him to, basically buy back, redeem your wife, the one who had committed harlotry, who had deserted him. God says, go and take her back, the one who deserted you. And it's a picture of what God was going to do for the children of Israel in bringing them back from captivity, ultimately back into the land. But also, I think, especially when you look at verse 5, seek the Lord their God and David their king, I think ultimately it's pointing forward to the time when Jesus would come, the one who would come and redeem us, pay a price for us, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18 and 19, not with corruptible things, as Peter said, like silver or gold, but with his own precious blood. So it's pointing forward to, you think about, and Scripture constantly does this, is, there will be, I guess, a shadow in the Old Testament, and then you point forward to Jesus Christ and what he came to do, and it's pointing forward to the much greater thing that he would do. I think we see that here, is as difficult as this is for Hosea to do, and you think about putting ourselves in his shoes and how challenging and difficult this would be, think about then what Jesus did, which is so much greater than this. So I think ultimately it is pointing us forward to what God was going to do for us through his son, Jesus Christ.
100%. And somebody might look at this and read this and say, how do you see Jesus in this? And, our answer would be, how can you not? And the idea of what you said, 1 Peter 1, 18 and 19 is spot on. The idea of buying back and redeeming. And God has done that through Christ and through his mercy. And we didn't deserve it. We were wrong. And we were dead in trespasses and sins, as Ephesians 2:1 tells us. So there's a great message of hope then. And I guess with that, as we close out this episode, we want to talk about some application. You've already touched on some right there, looking to the New Testament time. But what else would you say, first 3 chapters, the overview, the theme, what application can we make, kind of as we close out our thoughts?
I think it's that God is merciful. God is also just. Some of the things I've been reading recently and things I've been working on, whether it's sermons or class or whatever, that's really stood out to me, is we have to continue to remind ourselves of that balance, because our tendency, I think, as human beings is we slide one way or the other on that. We tend to emphasize one over the other, or one to the neglect of the other, whether it's God's mercy or whether it's God's justice. But what you see in this book is this is a book that over and over again, and the rest of the Bible emphasizes this too, is God is the righteous judge of all the earth who will do right. God is also merciful, and he's loving, and he longs to forgive, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance, 2 Peter 3:9. So I think in these first 3 chapters, we're going to see this throughout the rest of this book too, but to me, that's a big one. Is you cannot have God's mercy without God's justice. They are both true, and they are both right, and they are both an integral part of who he is. And it's our responsibility to not to ignore one or to exalt one over the other, but to see them both for what they truly are, as this is who God is. He is just, He is also merciful. And both of those are vitally important in Scripture, and especially in the book of Hosea.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well said. That's a great way to close out this first episode that we're recording. Again, this is part one of a two-part study, so we hope and pray that you'll join us next week. Next week, we're going to be looking at chapters 4 through 14. And so I want to encourage you between now and then to read this text and to jot down some thoughts and join us next week as we close out this study. But Jameson, appreciate you being on. Looking forward to part 2. And to our listeners, we thank you for listening. We hope that this episode will help you in some way to weather the storm. Thank you, and may God bless you.